Good morning. Welcome to the Delta X workshop data meeting. And so Delta X is a project that is based on the Mississippi River Delta. And the first speaker is the principal investigator of the project, and is also a senior scientist at the JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California, and is Marc Simard.
Thank you for the applause. Okay, so Delta X, as Sergio mentioned, is a project, NASA-funded project. It's actually one of 5 projects that were selected for the EVS-3, Earth Venture Suborbital. And it is also the only one that is over land. So it's a very timely project that looks and investigates, in particular, the Mississippi River Delta in southern Louisiana. So if we look at the trends of land loss and gain since 1988 using Landsat data, we can see that there are large regions that are losing land at a rate of about 54 kilometers square per year. You can see on the eastern side in the Terrebonne region, most of the loss is found in that region. If you look more on the western side in Atchafalaya Basin, we're actually gaining land. So Delta X is looking at these two very different basins, which represent extremes of land loss and gain. And if you translate 54 kilometers square per year, it's about equivalent to losing a football field of land per hour, which supports what the USGS has found in the past. So there are 2 processes by which land can keep up with sea level rise. The first one is by mineral deposition of sediments. So the sediments that are transported down by the Mississippi River Delta and get deposited at the mouth of the river to form the deltas. The other process is through plant growth. So organic accretion of sediment on the soil. So you're elevating soil from the mineral deposition and the organic deposition. So Delta X looks in particular at these 2 processes using a set of airborne and in situ observations. This project involves 12 co-investigators from 8 different institutions, all of them in coastal states, which are listed here. So Delta X uses 3 different aircrafts with instruments on board with concurrent in situ measurements to calibrate and validate those remote sensing measurements, but also to calibrate and validate the models that Delta X is developing. So here's the Delta X framework. We have the center row here, the models. We have hydrodynamic models and ecological models or ecogeomorphic models, which are combined. And these models are used to predict the future and the fate of different parts of the deltas. These models are calibrated and validated using remote sensing data, which is the top row here, as well as in situ data. Here are the 3 instruments that are being flown. 2 of them are radar sensors. The first one, UAVSAR, allows measurements of water level change within the wetlands. So as the tide comes in and out of the system, we can see this tide migrating. AirSWAT, on the other hand, measures water surface elevation in open water areas. So UAVSAR within the wetlands where there's grass, because the radar has such a wavelength that it penetrates vegetation and can see the water below the canopy. AirSWAT cannot do that. It has to look at river surfaces or lakes or lagoons and the ocean. So we have these very complementary measurements of water surface elevation. The third instrument, AVIRS-NG, is an imaging spectrometer. AVIRS-NG has two purposes. One is to look at water quality. So we use this sensor to look at the concentration of sediment within that water that we're observing with the radars. And AVIRS-NG also looks at vegetation structure, in particular biomass and species composition. The Delta X airborne and field campaign occurred in 2021 in the spring and the fall, which coincide with the high discharge of the Mississippi River Delta and the low discharge. One thing to note here is that the low discharge, which is starts like around August and September, will also reach the peak biomass. So we have two extremes that are observed by the Delta X campaign. So here's just a little movie of these three, just a sec. I don't know how to, sorry, there's somebody that's requesting. I don't know if you see that on your screen, but. Okay, sorry, a little technical issue. Please do not request to annotate. Anyway, so we have the three aircrafts here, which are typically flying near simultaneously. In this case, they are flying simultaneously. Don't worry, they are at very different altitudes, so there were no chances of collision. But each of these three aircrafts were flying to observe different parts of the system. Again, the radar are looking at the hydrodynamics, while AVIRS-NG looks at the water quality and vegetation. At the same time, we had teams in the field collecting data on vegetation structure, as well as water quality and dynamics measurements. And we had 7 sites where we did intensive measurements. And just to summarize this whole experiment, all of this data is available on the web, and this is what we'll be discussing mainly today, this morning. So we collected data in different sites that represented the diversity of vegetation types that is found in the Mississippi River Delta. Here are some of the measurements that were collected that include biomass measurement, stem count, soil cores, etc. We also had water quality measurements as well as the dynamics, which includes, for example, ADCP measurements as well as water level as a function of time every 15 minutes. So while we're making these measurements in situ, we collected airborne data. Here is one of the coverage from UAVSAR. UAVSAR flew in what we call a racetrack pattern. So it went around and around, trying to capture the tide as it came in and out of the system. So each of these flights lasts about 5 hours. So each of the series of measurement lasts 5 hours, which is pretty good to catch this tide propagation. And here, just to make sure this is understood, only with airborne remote sensing can you capture these very fast and dynamic processes like tides. It is not possible to capture these processes with spaceborne missions currently, unless you'd have a geostationary system. But currently, only with airborne remote sensing can you capture these types of processes. So here's the air SWOT coverage. Again, air SWOT measures open water surfaces, elevation of open water surfaces. Some of you may be interested looking at water surface slope. The water surface slope along channels will control the discharge of the river. So that's a very important parameter that we're measuring here. This is something that's very hard to do at these accuracies with gauges only. We're talking about slopes on the order of 1 to 3 centimeters per kilometer. So this is very, very flat. And air SWOT is able to capture that. And here on top of air SWOT, we have the UAVSAR coverage and the AVIRIS NG coverage. And as you notice, we're only looking at, again, the Atchafalaya Basin on the west and the Terrebonne Basin, which is center of the floodplain. So here is a summary of these coverages and a summary of the measurements that we're collecting. So at the bottom is one example of a transect of the water surface elevation. And as I mentioned earlier, so the slopes that we're looking at are on the order of a few centimeters per kilometer. On the top right, we have a UAVSAR. So UAVSAR, each of the pixels corresponds to almost like a gauge measurement, so a water surface elevation change. And at the bottom right, we have water quality, so the amount of sediments, concentration of sediment in the water. So what do we do with all of these measurements? Well, we calibrate hydrodynamic models. So here's an example of a hydrodynamic model implementation that was developed by University of Texas. And we are comparing these models to make sure that they're okay with the remote sensing measurements. And here is one example. So we have on the right, we have the model implementation. This one is using Anuga, an open source hydrodynamic implementation. And on the left, you have a comparison with UAVSAR. So this is how we calibrate our hydrodynamic models, is by comparison with the remote sensing and in situ data. So we can calibrate the parameters such as friction and bathymetry. So all of this data is currently public. It's all available on the web, and this is what we're discussing today. We're up to the delivery of the L4 calibrator dynamic model, which will be in the fall, this fall. So we're pretty far, we're pretty advanced in the development of this project as it ends in April 2025. So here's the agenda, and we have a few very good talks. They're very short, so hopefully you guys can follow. Otherwise, I invite you all to visit the DeltaX website and the ORNL website to find more information. And I believe there are some recordings from the previous open data workshops, and probably this one might also be available. So you'll be able to push pause if things are going a bit too fast. So the next speaker, Matt. In the meantime, you can come. Yeah, there was a question in the audience. Yeah, so the requirement for the SWOT satellite, which was... Huh? Oh, yes, the question was, can SWOT make measurements as accurate as what Air SWOT is doing and what's needed for river deltas? So SWOT is a satellite that was launched in December. It is a spaceborne instrument. The requirement is 1.7 centimeter per kilometer, which means this is as good as it will get given the requirements. From the early data analysis, we may actually be able to do better than that, reaching what is needed for river deltas.